everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Welcome to US History. This is the start of the course that will take the entire semester in which we will cover the entire history of the United States country, the United States of America. Now, because we are doing this in a single semester and the United States history is extremely complex, this is very much a survey course hitting the most important points that historians generally consider to be major turning points. But this is not the end-all, be-all history of the United States by far. You could spend entire college courses on single aspects of single lessons here. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, because today we're going to start talking about how America decided to maybe we should not be owned by England. Let's get started. So before we can get into all the bald eagles and the flying, waving American flags and all the patriotism, whether that's accurate or not, we got to start talking about, obviously, some history here in U.S. history. So we're going to start today picking up on the start of this course. So the start of this course is 1763 with something called the Proclamation of 1763. I don't expect you to know what any of that means, because it's the start of the course. But if I just started with the Proclamation of 1763, it may not make any sense to you on what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a little backstory here that brings you up to the Proclamation of 1763 and understand why that is so important. All right, this picture here, this is George Washington crossing the Delaware River in the Revolutionary War. We're going to get back to this specific picture and this story a few lessons from now. But let's pick up today. We're in the 1700s in what is present day the United States. This map here. This is the colonial regions of the United States at the time. Meaning that all of these, what we call states today, were colonies of Great Britain at the time. England owned the colonies, all right? So England had owned the colonies since the beginning, since Jamestown and these other colonies had come out. The difference is that England is over 4,000 miles away from the East Coast, what is present day America, which leads to a very unique relationship between England and the United States in the New World that was not the same with a lot of England's other colonies, other things they owned around the world. Which leads to this concept of salutary neglect, all right? So salutary neglect sounds like a big fancy word, but all it really means is, do whatever you want. America, they were just the British colonies, the people that lived in what is present day America at the time, they were colonists. They were citizens of England. There were all these rules that the colonists had to follow since England owned them. However, the colonists a lot of times broke these rules because they didn't want to follow them, specifically when it came to stuff like trade. It was very common for the colonies to not do what they were supposed to when it came to trade. Colonists were required to ship all of their goods that they produced in the colonies, specifically tobacco at the time, to England so England could sell it, all right? And that was the rule. Well, the colonies realized that England was ripping them off, and they were actually cool with being ripped off as long as England left them alone, because the colonies in the New World actually got to pretty much rule themselves. Well, there's about 10% of the stuff they're supposed to send to England, they just sell it on the side, which is a big no-no, and England should come in and stop colonists from selling these products at a profit to other countries and not just giving it to England. Now, 90% of the stuff makes it to England, 10% didn't. England realizes it's actually cheaper to not enforce this law, all right, because they have to send their whole navy over. It would cost them more money to stop the colonists from breaking these rules than it would be to enforce it, because the navy cost a bunch of money. So because of this, England just blatantly allows America or the colonies at the time, that would be called America here for this course, to just do whatever they wanted, more or less, within reason. I mean, you couldn't like sell all your your goods, but you could sell a large enough portion that you could make a profit off of it. And England saw America breaking the rules and decided not to enforce it because it would have caused England more money to have to enforce it. The fact that England sees America breaks the rules and doesn't stop them from doing it for like 100 years is called salutary neglect, where England just pretends like they don't even see this as happening. Because England is so far away from the colonies, that's what makes this different. England micromanaged all their other colonies that were in Europe and Africa, even some in Asia, much more strictly than they did the colonies in the New World because it was easier to access those places. The colonies liked the fact that they were being left alone. They liked the fact that they could really do whatever they wanted, and yeah, they had to follow rules, but unless they really didn't want to, and it gave the colonists this kind of sense of freedom and independence that they had experienced for most of the 1700s, with the concept of salutary neglect, where England chooses to neglect the colonies. And again, the colonies liked this. So the question here, and what you need to do is pause me. I'm very pausable when you get to these questions, and answer these questions in 2 complete sentences. So the question here is, why were the American colonies treated with a hands-off approach by England when England's other colonies around the world were much more strictly regulated? So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. This leads us to this thing called the French and Indian War. Now, you might be thinking about the French and Indian War, and you're like, oh, the France fought the Indians? That seems odd. No, the French and the Indians team up together, all right? They called it the 7 Years' War, all right? Worldwide. England and France, they have beef, all right? So, and this is going to connect to salutary neglect, and this is all going to make sense here, but this is another little side story we're going to connect here in a second to the salutary neglect with that story. So salutary neglect and the French and Indian War are going to make a lot of sense here on how it's going to tick off with the colonies. So England and France, they have beef. They've had beef for a really, really long time. They're always going to war. Somebody talked about somebody's mama, somebody stepped on somebody else's sneaker. Something happens, they go to war. So these colonies that you own around the world, like England owns the colonies that we call America today, they make a lot of money for England because we're being forced to send them all our goods like tobacco. France thinks, hey, if we can take over the colonies from England, we can make the money that England is making off of the colonies. France doesn't want to just take over the colonies in the New World, in America. They want to take over all of England's colonies. So France launches this massive invasion all over the world to take over all of England's colonies and directly fight England. It is called the 7 Years' War. Since the colonies don't really give a crap of what's happening in Europe, we don't call it the 7 Years' War in our history. We call it the French and Indian War because that's the only thing that really affected the colonists. So France came over to the New World and they tried to take over the colony. So all the blue area here are places where France comes in the mid 1700s, all right, late in the 1750s, all right, and they're trying to take over all the area that England controls, all right, which is the pink areas here. France is not coming over to kill the colonists that live here because they want the colonists to continue working so they can get their tobacco, all right. So there'd be no reason to harm any of the colonists. So France, since they're fighting over the entire world, they can't send their whole army over. So what France does is when they come over to the New World with their smaller army they have because it's split up around the world here in the blue areas, they team up with the Native Americans and they tell the Native Americans, if you join us and we fight England and we win, we will give you back all this land that got stolen from you by the evil English. So, not surprisingly, a lot of Native Americans who had tons of land having been stolen from them over the previous hundreds of years of colonization here and absolute genocide and a whole nother thing that's outside the purview of a survey course of U.S. history, that the Native Americans were like, absolutely. The Native Americans don't realize that the French are absolute liars. If they win this, they're not giving the Indians the land back. The French want the land. Anyway, So the French and the Indians team up to fight the English. That's why it's called the French and Indian War, because they teamed up with each other. So you had the French, which is here on the right, American Indians, and they are going to be fighting the Redcoats, which is England, the most powerful military in the world at the time. So England, to defend the colonies, they send out their troops all over the world, including to the New World. And they come over here to the New World, the Redcoats do, and they defend the colonists from the American Indians and the French. If you notice here, you know who's not fighting? The colonists, right? They're just out working in their fields, doing their normal thing, and there's like all this fighting taking place around them. So there's quite a few big battles between the French and Indians and the English. What you need to know about this, all right, the important takeaway is that the English are going to win. They're going to effectively defeat the French, all right? The French and Indians, their teamwork, and the French are going to flee and they're going to go back to France. The Native Americans who fought and lost in this war, called the French and Indian War, all right, are obviously going to stay in the New World. Well, now there's hostilities between the Native Americans and the colonists, because the Native Americans were actively fighting, joining the military to get their lands back. And even though that failed, you've kind of unlocked this Pandora's box, this tension in between these two groups that is still there when the fighting stops. Even though the colonists themselves weren't fighting in this war, Native Americans have now kind of taken that step to aggressively, if not take back lands, aggressively fight against colonists that try to take the lands in the future in a more organized fashion. So after the French and Indian War, there is tensions between the colonists and the Native Americans here in the New World that have been separated, really because once the colonists took over these colonies, it kind of pushed them on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, that we'll get to here in a second. But the question here is, how did the French and Indian War, after the war was over, cause increased tensions between the Native Americans and the colonists? So explain why, after the French and Indian War ended, there was higher tension between the Indians and the colonists. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So this brings us to 1763. This is the start of our course. On October 7th, 1763, England issues the Proclamation of 1763. And it really wasn't expected to be a big situation. Like, England was actually shocked at the response that they get. So let me show you a map here to explain it, all right? So there is this concept of salutary neglect. England might have rules, but they weren't really going to enforce them. The colonists really liked their independence, like with the small I. They like being able to do what they want to. Sure, there's rules, but they don't want to follow them. They don't have to. And it's just been that way for a long time. Everybody's been cool with this. Well, because there's so much tension between Native Americans and the colonists after the French and Indian War, England feels like they need to come in and protect the colonists from the Indians, and also protect the colonists from themselves. So the whole place here on the map that is colored in, that's Indian country. That is basically uncontrolled land in the New World. That's Indians live out there. And again, the Native Americans that live there aren't a huge fan of the colonists for a multitude of reasons. So the line that divides Indian country and the colonies in geography terms is the Appalachian Mountains, all right? Nobody ever really travels over the Appalachian Mountains because it's really hard to get supplies and materials on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. So nobody had ever really gone over the Appalachian Mountains except to like explore. So it's never really been a thing. Well, England, wanting to make sure tensions don't skyrocket and people start getting killed over here, they make a new rule, and this is what the Proclamation of 1763 says. It says, hey, colonists, just so crazy stuff doesn't happen, you are not allowed to go over the Appalachian Mountains anymore. What's interesting here is the colonists this applies to weren't going to go over the Appalachian Mountains anyway. And nobody cared prior to the Proclamation of 1763, but England then made a new rule. And America's pretty stubborn. The colonists are pretty rebellious people. Being told you can't do something you may not have done to begin with, gets the colonists worked up. They're like, what do you mean I can't go over there? They're like, yeah, you can't cross the Appalachian Mountains. And they're like, okay, well, this is going to be like one of those other rules that we have that we don't actually have to follow. Well, England, because they need to protect this concept of the colonists over here in the New World, don't want them getting killed, they go and take troops and actually station them all along this border between Indian country and the colonists and enforce this law. This is a game changer. And England is actually really caught off guard that the colonists are so upset over this, because this is not the fact that you can't cross the Appalachian Mountains anymore. That's not what upsets the colonists. What upsets the colonists is you're telling us we can't do something. Because it's like they didn't want to do it until they were told they can't do it. Now they want to, and they're not allowed to. England now, after 150 years of salutary neglect, have now, completely done away with that. Because salutary neglect means we'll make a rule, but we won't enforce it. Now England is actually enforcing their laws with troops. And for the very first time, the colonists, who technically are British citizens, are now upset that they feel like they're being controlled and confined here in the New World. And it's the very beginnings of these tensions that are going to rise, of this idea that we don't want to be controlled by somebody else. England views the colonies as an extension of them. The colonies, from the Proclamation of 1763, start viewing England as a separate entity, and on a very small scale, and it will grow. But the question here is, how does a Proclamation of 1763 nullify, means throw out, salutary neglect, and why does this upset the colonists? So again, salutary neglect was, we'll make rules, but we won't really enforce it. Well, they are clearly willing to enforce the rules. This makes you feel like you're grounded. It kind of feels like it takes away some of the colonists' independence, some of their freedom. They're kind of being micromanaged. That is what is going to upset the colonists. So pause me here, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So in the grand scheme of things, when it comes down to what will lead to the Revolutionary War here, taxes is talked about a lot, all right? And it is a huge part of the story of America declaring their independence. There's a couple very important things you need to understand about the taxes that England starts putting on the colonies. Number one, these taxes only applied to the colonies. That was the first thing, all right? The taxes themselves, all right, are designed because England feels the colonies owe England a big old thank you in the form of taxes. In England's mind, they saved the colonies from the evil French from taking them over. All right, and England spent a ton of money to defend the colonies. Well, the problem is, all right, you had to pay back all that money that you had to spend during the war. England thinks, I'm sure the colonies would be cool with this since, hey, we were defending them. So England makes it mandatory for the colonists to pay all these extra taxes that other people that England owns, other colonies, even the people that live in Britain, they themselves aren't having to pay. So that's one of the first things here, all right? That there's extra taxes on the colonies that England thinks the colonies owe it to England. The second thing is it's never about the money. The taxes in the grand scheme of things weren't overwhelming and crushing, all right? Yeah, they were high, but they weren't upset about losing money. It's the disrespect, all right? The colonies were very upset that they had no say-so in these taxes. There is a very important quote that comes out here of no taxation without representation. The colonies aren't upset over the taxes. They understand taxes have to happen. It's the disrespect. And the statement is no taxation without representation. Here's how those two things go together. So the only people that are having to pay the taxes are the colonists. The people inside England that live in England that are supposed to be the same level of citizens, they don't have to pay their taxes. There is a parliament in England that basically decides on taxes and who pays them. The parliament represents the British citizens that live in England. The colonists have nobody that fights for them in parliament. There's nobody that represents the colonists. So when England makes these laws, they're like, we're going to make them pay it. What are they going to do about it? They can't vote us out. They can't do any of this other stuff. The colonists get very upset. If everybody in the entire British Empire had to pay the same taxes, this might be nothing. But the fact that the colonists, who are rebellious by nature, we like our independence, we don't like being grounded, now we feel like we're being even disrespected more. We have to pay taxes that Britain doesn't. And not only that, people that live in Britain don't have to, but the other colonies around the world don't have to pay it. The American colonies get pretty grumpy at this fact that we're being forced to do something we don't want to. Again, it's not necessarily about the taxes themselves. They're not crazy high. I mean, they were very high. They were. I'm not going to say that they weren't, but that is not the money aspect. It's not a financial thing. It's a disrespect. Being forced to pay taxes, and we have no say-so. We can't complain to it. We can't vote politicians out. We can't make our voice heard. That is what gets the colonists worked up here with these additional taxes. So the question here is, what does the term no taxation without representation mean for the colonists? And how are colonists treated different than other British citizens when it came to representation? So pause that. We just got done talking about that. Answer that completely. And we'll move on. All right. So this is a crazy situation that happens. And this is where tensions start to skyrocket. So Boston, 1770. So Boston is kind of the heart of people that are upset at the treatment from England. It is the largest port at the time. It's in Massachusetts in it was called the New England area. It's a group of colonies that collectively are referred to as New England, like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, and so they are called the New England colonies because the weather in that area is very similar to England, and therefore when people came over here, the Puritans and Pilgrims, the population kind of boomed up there. They were more used to that climate. Anyway, so Boston is kind of the hotbed for this unhappiness with having to pay these new taxes. And a lot of dissent, people talking trash, all this other stuff. England, realizing there's some tensions, sends troops, redcoats, over to Boston in order to basically make sure it doesn't get out of hand. It's a very interesting dynamic that happens when the redcoats show up. Because keep in mind, everybody in the colonies is a British citizen. Your army is the redcoats. They're the ones that just protected you from the evil French. Well, when the redcoats show up to keep the peace in Boston, it really feels like there's like a foreign military influence in your town. Like this growing sense of us and you as opposed to we're all on the same team. England is still trying to figure out why this idea is growing, this idea that we're not on the same team. And in large part, it's just America likes to be left alone. The colonists as a whole, just a different culture has grown. An event happens in 1770 that is really going to change the trajectory of this tension. On March 5th, 1770, there is a group of soldiers just on patrol. Group of drunk people show up, and that happens quite a few times in American history. Group of drunk people show up and start throwing snowballs at the redcoats. The crowd gets bigger. Redcoats call for backup. It's a lot of he said, she said situations, which, if it wasn't a survey course, it is a wild story to go into. But tensions rise, and the redcoats open fire into a crowd of people that are throwing snowballs and things at them. They kill 5 Bostonians, 5 people in Boston, all right, get killed in one volley. The Redcoats walk away. The Redcoats are actually arrested for murder for this. I mean, it was a big thing. They actually put them on trial. John Adams, who we'll talk about as the second president of the United States, actually defends them and kind of proves that they were instigated to open fire. It was a big mistake. It was an accident. They ended up being acquitted. It's a whole another thing, whole another cool story. But 5 Americans got killed that were not carrying guns, so they were unarmed. 5 Americans get killed by the Redcoats in Boston. If that was the story, we might not be talking about it right now. But that's not what the story becomes. It gets called the Boston Massacre. There is a guy named Paul Revere, all right? He's in charge of the newspapers, all right? And he draws a picture. This is the picture that gets put in the newspapers that circulates the country, all right? It in this picture is not factual, all right? You got the commanding officer, all right, standing behind his men, ordering them to fire on these people dressed in their Sunday best. You got a puppy here, this looks like an execution. And he calls it the Boston Massacre. When it goes to trial, these men are acquitted because it was self-defense. This is not what happened. These guys got cornered, they had to open fire, and is there good guys and bad guys? Not really, but this picture, sure enough, sure makes it look like who's the bad guy? The Redcoats. That they're just opening fire and innocent civilians. I mean, they got a puppy here. Who doesn't love puppies? All right? This picture circulates the entire, I'll say, country, all the colonies. And it is referred to by Paul Revere as the Boston Massacre. From this point on, who's the bad guy? England. They're taxing us, trying to ground us, tell us we can't cross the Appalachian Mountain to the Proclamation of 1763. Now they're opening fire on innocent people. All right? This here, the depiction of this, what is in the media, drastically changes the perception of the Redcoats and England and America to where people start turning against, for the first time, England as a parent company, parent country. And moving forward, there is a direct line from the Boston Massacre to America declaring their independence. So the question here is, how did the media influence people's perception of the Boston Massacre? And why do you think the media at the time wanted to push a narrative? Why? So the question here is, why do you think Paul Revere blatantly, and because he had firsthand account of this, why would he depict it in this fashion in the newspaper? All right? Because he had an end result in his mind, and he pretty much is going to get it. What do you think Paul Revere wanted when he decided to change the truth, to show everybody else? Because there's no Google at the time. There's no other way to go defend against this. If it was in the paper, this is fact. All right? Regardless if it's what happened or not, it was fact, and that's what people believed from here on. So, not only this, how does it influence, as we just talked about, why do you think Paul Revere, this one man, in his mind, why do you think he chose to change this narrative of what really happened to what he showed? All right, that's as far as we'll get today. See you guys tomorrow.